Ahoy there, Captain Benzie here, coming at you with another video for Eve Echoes. In today's video, we're going to be taking our first proper look at the new capital ships, the carriers. 4 of these have been added to the virtual test interference, and we're going to be having a look at how these actually stand up against each other, and I'm going to be talking about these in regards to Eve Echoes in general. Now, I did do this for Dreadnoughts a couple of weeks back, and some of you kind of mentioned that you would have liked to have seen me go into the individual stats on the Dreadnoughts themselves and compare them side by side. I didn't want to do that because I was anticipating there may be changes between the Dreadnoughts as they were in the test and going live at launch, but many of you gave me positive feedback on that and said, you know what, it'd still be interesting, so we're going to be doing that today. I'm going to be looking at the 4 carriers as we currently have them. I'm going to be talking about how they do in virtual test interference, and then talking about how to extrapolate that information outwards as to how these are actually going to be on live if they launch the way they currently are, and maybe we'll have a little bit of a chat about balance and some possible suggestions or changes that I might have for these. Now, if you do enjoy this video, please let me know by hitting like on it, sub to the channel for all things Eve Echoes, making sure to ding that notification bell and tap all notifications so that you never miss an upload. I do apologise as well, I am out at Masuna fishing camp at the moment, so if there are any connection issues or unusual sounds and things like that, please bear with me. I'm currently sitting in a very hot 42 degrees Celsius room in order to record this to the best of my ability. Anyway, with all of that said and done then, let's jump right in to talking about the 4 different carriers as they currently stand in Eve Echoes. Now, before we kick things off having a look at the Amar Empire's Archon, I just wanted to talk about carriers in general and how they sort of, are in virtual test interference. Now, it's worth mentioning that yes, whilst the carriers do all have their own unique skill bonuses and things like that, none of that is actually active when we're flying virtual test interference on account of none of us having the skills that would actually trigger those. None of us have carrier command or light fighter operation and things like that, so those skill bonuses are not active. It's also worth noting that yes, of course, in virtual test interference, the rats do have a lot less HP than they would normally have, and they do lower damage than they normally would as well for a ship of their tech level in a standard anomaly or encounter. This is because these ships do not have their full stat bonuses behind them. You're not getting the full skill bonuses, so the enemy rats have been scaled down accordingly. It's also worth noting that all of the carriers do share the same fitting profile of 5 mid slots, a whopping 8 low slots, and the ability to launch 3 waves of fighters. They also both have 3 of the engineering rigs and 3 combat rigs. Finally, on the subject of things that they all share, they have the same roll bonus, a 400% increase to Entosis Link activation time, which makes these excellent for capturing citadels. They have a jump drive available, and that's something we'll talk about at length in other videos. It basically means they can jump without using stargates and can jump straight to a lit cynosural field beacon in a distant star system, which is pretty awesome. It's what we call hot dropping. They can also confit command bursts, and they get a 100% command burst effective range increase. So that's what they all get, the same. All carriers have that exact same thing there. It's only once we look at light fighter operation and carrier command that the ships start to really differentiate themselves, other than, of course, like the basic info with their overall defenses and things like that. Now, when we look at the Archon, we have Light Fighter Operation bonus, which gives it a 5% increase to Light Fighter Turret Optimal Range, obviously a 25% increase there at full training. Light Fighters essentially have turrets on them that they are then using against enemy ships, whether you're going up against other Light Fighters or up against whatever you're targeting. And they have turrets, and those turrets work exactly the same way as turrets on your own ship as well. So here the Archon gets a bonus to the optimal range of those, and they are laser turrets dealing only electromagnetic damage. Now, in EVE Online, fighters do also have a secondary weapon system, which is usually a torpedo bank, which does a lot of damage, but it can only be fired once before the fighters then have to return to the carrier, essentially to restock. And I don't see anything here that actually suggests that the fighters in EVE Echoes are going to get that. So, I don't know. We'll have to have a look at this a bit more once I can get my hands on it properly in live, and once I can run things on Fulmination a bit better. I'll do some testing and see what I can find there. It's also worth noting then that the Archon, its carrier command bonus, is a 4% armor resistance increase, 20% at full training there, so it gets a lot thicker armor in regards to its resistances, which is pretty sweet. Obviously that doesn't affect if it's 0, but it does mean if you're putting rigs in, you can really boost up the Archon's resistances on its armor tank pretty heavily. It also gets a plus 1% increase to Armored Command burst strength, so a 5% increase there at full training, and activation time of 5% increase there as well. It's really not much, and it's not going to, hold a candle if you have someone else in your fleet already using Armored Command bursts on something like a command ship, Prophecy Command or whatever, then that's probably going to be better than the Archon has, but hey, at the same time, the fact that the Archon can do it is pretty sweet. Now, in the virtual test interference, I actually struggled with the Archon more than any of the others. I'm not sure if it's just that the fighters themselves doing EM damage only, I just nuked through shields but then struggled on everything else, or if it was just me having some really bad lag at the time. I did, put up on Twitter yesterday, I don't know if anyone saw, me having, and on YouTube in fairness, a screenshot of how bad my internet has been recently. We haven't actually activated the fiber optics line yet. And I was having a situation where every time I would go to the next wave, it wouldn't load the modules on. So I'm hitting wave 3 with just basically what the Archon started with, which was not fun. I didn't actually make it to wave 4 at all on any of the Archon ones. Even when I did have, things did load properly, the Archon seemed to struggle just a bit more than some of the others. That said, I think once it's got that armor resistance and the optimal range there on the fighters, it will do a lot better. I think it is just the fact that it had none of those, and its other stats can be a little bit underwhelming by comparison, perhaps, and the fighters, as I said, being electromagnetic as well, may not have done it any favours. Moving on then to the Gallente Federation's Thanatos. This one I had a bit more luck with, and I actually do quite like the look of how this one is. It's an interesting hull design that certainly is better than a lot of Gallente designs historically have been otherwise. Now, the Thanatos, as I said, did a lot better for me. That very well might be due to the fact that it was thermal damage coming off its fighter banks rather than electromagnetic, and obviously thermal does a little bit better against armor than otherwise the electromagnetic might do. But ultimately, I quite like the Thanatos. It still wasn't the best one for me, but I like how it looks, and when I look at its stats, there's a part of me that thinks this could be really quite interesting. Now, like the Archon, it still gets a plus 1%, 5% at full training, Armored Command burst strength, and Armored Command burst activation time bonus. Unlike the Archon, though, it's a 5% increase, 25 at full training, increase to light fighter turret damage. So once this is trained, the Thanatos is going to do more damage than the Archon. There's no two ways about that. The Archon doesn't have any damage boosts, it's only got the optimal range increase, whereas the Thanatos is going to be able to apply an additional 25% damage. And considering that when you look at the fighter, the fighter waves, when you are launching those, and you can check their stats, they all have the same basic DPS. That means when a Thanatos is leveled up, it is going to have 25% higher DPS than the Archon, for instance. Obviously doing thermal damage if it's using those particular fighters. We then also get the bonus to light fighter effective hit points, 5% per level, 25% at full training. Now, obviously during virtual test interference, none of these skills are active, but even if they were, that doesn't really do much because enemy ships, pirates, don't seem to fire at the fighters. It's going to be like drones where carrier fighters are not shot at by NPCs by the looks of things. But in a PvP situation where someone is obviously going to try and shoot your fighters down, then that additional 25% EHP there could really provide a nice bit of assistance. It's mainly the light fighter turret damage though that I think is going to make the Thanatos a very popular option, because this means it's actually going to be pretty good for PvE also. If I'm still not quite willing to commit and say that actually, you know what, capital ships are going to be good for PvE, I'm not going to say that yet. I definitely don't think the dreadnoughts are, but I think the carriers are going to have the capability somewhat of actually assisting in PvE, if not actually being able to solo some of it themselves. We'll have to see how that one actually goes. Now that I can bring this up on Fulmination, I do intend to jump into some anomalies, give it a try, and just see how they actually go. But again, I can't train the skills here on Fulmination yet. They don't exist, so they're all going to be just as naked as they are in in virtual test interference, but without the rats being at the sort of the lower health and that they are. So looking at virtual test, I think that, yeah, it's possible that the Thanatos might be useful for solo PvE. Therefore, if you're training into carriers, you might have a bit more usage out of them, but we'll see. The Kaldari State Chimera actually did a little bit better, and I have to be careful saying that name out loud because it's also my cat's name and she's sitting on the bed just behind the microphone, and I really don't want her to come over and start loving it. As gorgeous as she is, that, you know, requires me to start recording again. Anyway, so the Kaldari one, yes, this I actually really enjoyed. I did a lot better with this. I came second and third quite a few times. Definitely, it's worth noting that carriers really suffer against dreadnoughts in virtual test interference. If you make it through to round 4 and other people are using dreadnoughts and they decide to take you out first, you are going to go down quickly, which means dreadnoughts definitely do serve a role as an anti-capital platform. So, but yeah, again, that doesn't really change much. Now, the Chimera itself, again, same roll bonus, same fitting profile. Light fighter operation gives us a turret explosion velocity bonus, which really kind of throws me here, because they're definitely firing turrets. The graphical animation for these is turrets, and turrets don't have an explosion velocity. So I don't know what's going on here. This is a hint that perhaps the different fighter banks may happen to have that secondary weapon of using like torpedoes or bombs or whatever, which would have an explosion velocity, but the turrets really don't. So as it currently stands, this stat appears that it's going to do nothing, and we'll talk about this more later on when we look at some of the more carrier generic stuff that we're going to be having a look at toward the end of this video, some of the like the modules and the stats and things on those. But for now, that's a really confusing stat. Explosion velocity on the light fighter turrets just doesn't really look like it's going to do it. That should surely be tracking speed. But hey, I don't know, I need to get to grips with this. It might be that the turrets are essentially using an explosion velocity and explosion radius sort of math behind them, at which point this would make sense. That's not how it works in EVE Online, but hey, that's how it might work in EVE Echoes, and that's a fairly elegant way of making it so that like the fighters aren't as good against smaller, faster ships as they are against some of the others. So it's possible. It's possible is what I'm saying. Now, Carrier Command, like the Archon, gives a 4% increase to resistance, but this time, of course, being a Kaldari ship, we're looking at shield resistance. So 20% increased shield resistance here on the Chimera at full training. I like that. It makes it pretty tanky, and it means that if the explosion velocity does actually increase the application there properly of the light fighters, then this is going to have good application, and it is going to be a very tanky ship indeed. And I like that. I really like that. It's also not got terrible capacitor, especially not having any skills in things. I really enjoyed flying this one in virtual test. Certainly kinetic, using kinetic damage on the fighters as well, works well against shields, well, it works okay against shields, works really nicely against armor as well. It's a good damage spread, and it seemed to do pretty well. It's also fairly tanky. It's less tanky there than the Archon was, but again, all of that is pretty much in its shields, which is just terrifying. It has a humongous shield bank, which just gets 20% better resistances at full training there of Carrier Command. This is an interesting one. I quite like the Chimera. I think it's going to do pretty well. If that is an application bonus, again, it might make it worthwhile for PvE. Who knows? I don't know. I need to get to grips with that a little bit more. I'm just theorizing here. But this one, it did well, and I quite like how it looks as well. That then brings us full circle to the Minmatar Republic's Nidhogger, which is by far my favourite looking of the 4 carriers. From above, it's actually fairly reminiscent of the Hurricane if you just kind of made it a bit more snubby. You get the massive fighter, the fighter bay opening at the front there. This, to me, just looks like a really badass ship. It's a Minmatar ship as well, which is always going to do well by my standings, but I genuinely like how this hull looks, and it's not like I like every Minmatar hull. Cough, cough, burst, cough, cough, with the, what's the other one? The Breacher. Couldn't think of the name of it for a moment there. Anyway, back to carriers. Again, same fitting profile, same roll bonuses. As we go down, though, we now have a light fighter operation bonus of, again, turret damage, 5% increase here, just like the Thanatos had. Again, you won't see that in application when you're flying this in virtual test interference on account of not having the light fighter operation skill trained, but it's there. Additional 5% damage per level, 25% of full training means that this is going to hit pretty hard. In addition to that, carrier command gives it a light fighter flight velocity of 5% up to 25% as well. One of the things I really found using the virtual test interference was that having that micro warp drive ability, the activatable micro warp drive for the fighters, really helped out, especially getting them to a target so they could start applying their damage a lot faster. So having a ship that gets additional turret damage and flight velocity on those fighters, to me, is kind of a double win situation. It's shield command burst strength on this one as well, just like it was on the Chimera. Now, that additional damage, that additional flight velocity, to me just means that this, if these are going to be viable for PvE, would absolutely be the one that I personally would be running and using. It is a little bit, the overall defense is pretty good. It's better overall than, for example, the Chimera was, but it's fairly evenly spread, so you don't have that huge shield tank that the Chimera had, and it's not as tanky as, say, the Archon or indeed the Thanatos. Otherwise, it is a little bit faster though. It's a Minmatar ship, of course, you would expect that. I really like the nidhogger. I also did pretty well with this one. I think I got into the final a couple of times with it. I think I actually even came second with the nidhogger once or twice. And I enjoyed this one. This was actually interesting. And if I ever do move up to carriers, this is what you're going to see me flying. Because of course, it's a Minmatar ship. It also looks really cool. And I just like the stat bonuses on this one. It's a really nice mix that's going to work well in PvP and possibly in PvE if it does turn out that the carriers are viable for doing that. So if we're all forced up into going into capitals, that's what I'm going to be flying, and I'll probably need to create a new character, level it up, and then just do that there. Or maybe Silent Rose will end up flying carriers next. Oh man, that's a harrowing thought right there. Let's round things off here then by having a look at the more generic, like, actual modules and fighters themselves, and indeed some of the rigs that we're going to be using in regards to carriers. Now, ultimately, we're going to have a look at these stats. Again, these are all the stuff that I can pull up on Fulmination currently. We'll cover this more in depth once carriers are actually out in the wild, and we can have a look. Now we're going to start off then by having a look at the fighters themselves. Now if you've not flown a carrier in virtual test interference yet, or if you haven't had the chance, then it's worth noting that you can kind of think of these like drones, but instead of each fighter being just one drone that flies around, it's actually a wave of 9. There are 9 fighters per wave. So when you put a drone wave into a drone tube, or whatever you want to call it, a fighter wave into a fighter tube or whatever, then ultimately you are putting 9 of these ships in, and when they fly around, you deal damage to them, and every time you deal damage to the wave. You don't deal damage to individual fighters, you deal damage to the wave. And that wave will lose HP, and once it loses whatever a ninth is in percentage, once it loses a ninth of its HP, it will lose a ninth of its damage as well, basically, and it will keep doing that until you destroy the full thing and get it down to 0. I don't know if they become harder to hit. In EVE Online, they don't. A wave of fighters is as easy to hit when it is a full wave as it is when it is just the one. So kind of think of it as, the graphic shows 9 ships, but think of it as an actual ship that has a certain amount of HP divided into 9 segments. Here you can see the Knight has an overall defense of 3,219, so take 3,219 times that by 9, and that's the total HP of the wave. And every time you do 3,219 damage to that wave, it loses a ninth of its actual capabilities as well, and eventually hits 0. Now there are 2 types of fighters. We didn't get to see this in virtual test interference. They all come just pre-equipped with one type of fighter, but there are 2 types of each. You'll find that there are light fighters, like attack fighters, and then there are anti-air fighters, and the differences are fairly subtle, but you'll see as we go through. Now, the one we're looking at here, first of all, let's jump onto the Templar, sorry. This is referred to as the Light Attack Recon Drone. This is the Light Attack Fighter Wave. Tech level 9 suggests that you need to be at Tech 9 in order to start using carriers. Not Tech 10, as I thought it might be beforehand, but again, I could be wrong on that. We have an activation time, optimal range, accuracy fall-off, exactly as we saw before. Interestingly, though, we still have explosion velocity and explosion radius. This does it seems to suggest that we might have that secondary weapon system, but I can't see anything that actually shows how it activates or works yet. So I don't know. I can't confirm that they have that second weapon system yet, other than that the stats seem to suggest that they would. We then have a damage fall-off multiplier, which again makes no sense, and if I tap on it, it doesn't come up here, so I don't actually know what that is yet. I need to do some more research. We then get flight velocity, orbital speed, and drone command range, which are, of course, all relevant if you are used to seeing these. And it's worth noting that 500 kilometers drone command range is pretty huge. It means that people can actually warp from one side of a fight to another, and your fighters will chase them down, and that's a big difference between fighters and drones. Now here we have the Light Attack Fighter. You can see its DPS is 93.67 here at the top, and it's got an optimal range of 10, accuracy fall-off of 5, with an activation time of 5 seconds. If we go across to the Knight, however, you'll see this has a faster activation time of 3.5 seconds, a longer optimal range of 20 kilometers, and a lower DPS overall of 42.9. This is described as a light anti-aircraft recon drone, dealing mainly electromagnetic damage. Now, back in April, I think it was, when Melos first revealed that carriers and dreadnoughts were coming, he said that carriers would have two types of fighter, one that was designed for going up against smaller targets like anti-frigate and anti-destroyer, and then there'd be one for cruisers and above. I'm not sure if the anti-air one is intended to be the frigate one, and then the Templar, in this case, the attack one, is for the larger ships, or how that's supposed to work. In EVE Online, it's more there's a short-range one and a long-range one. Think of one using autocannons and one using strike cannons, for example. Here, the naming convention seems to suggest that actually the Knight, in this case, being anti-aircraft, would be used to take out other fighters, possibly even other drones, but yeah, it might also work well against frigates, the smaller, faster targets there, whereas the Templar would be better against larger ships. We don't know. Again, I'll be getting my hands on this sooner or later. We then have two modules which were available as part of the test, and these are both the Fighter Fire Control Array and the Fighter Micro Warp Drive Guide. Now we'll start with the Control Array first of all. This is basically a weapon upgrade module, kind of like a drone damage amplifier or a gyro stabilizer, heatsink, that kind of thing. You fit this onto a ship and it has an activation time adjustment straight up for the things themselves. You can also then activate it, and it gives a bigger boost overall. Which is pretty cool. The stats here aren't shown properly. It does appear that the DPS increases just by having this fit, just like any other weapon upgrade module, but it doesn't show you how much the activating this module actually pushes it up. It's also interesting to note that during the test, these seemed to be bugged. Once you fitted one of these and activated it, it had a 30-second activation time, and it just seemed to keep activating. It didn't seem to actually have that 60-second reactivation delay. So I don't know how that's working. Is that bugged? Is that intentional? How is this supposed to work? Is it going to be, I'm assuming it's going to be just like a drone damage amplifier. It increases the activation time adjustment and the damage bonus of the fighters, and then you can activate it for a 30-second boost to those stats, and then it's a 60-second cooldown before you can activate it again. Now, the Fighter Micro Warp Drive Guide, I mentioned this briefly earlier. This essentially gives your fighters a boost of micro warp drive. They suddenly go 528% faster, but have a signature radius adjustment of 500%, just like you'd activated a micro warp drive on your own ship. What this does is it means that they can clear the gap between being launched straight out of your carrier, and actually hitting the enemy. And if an enemy tries to move away, then you can chase them down. Now, fighters actually aren't exactly slow moving. If we have a look at them here, you've got a basic flight velocity of 1156 meters per second, and if we look at the Templar, just to compare, it's 963 meters per second. So by the time you activate a micro warp drive, this can chase down, it can chase chase down some of the more slower frigates and can definitely chase down things like destroyers and cruisers and that. Pretty much no real worry. And that's, of course, before we've got any skills into light fighter operation and things like that, which I do anticipate will have some flight velocity on them. So I don't know, but this was very, very useful, especially when a wave spawned on the other side of my carrier. You can activate this and your fighters will just clear that distance a little bit faster and start applying their damage sooner. Let's then have a look at the rigs, because the rigs get a little bit interesting here. First of all, the Fighter Range Extender. This does exactly what you'd expect it to, and it increases accuracy fall-off adjustment for your fighters. So your fighters' turrets get better accuracy fall-off. Not anything crazy, but there it is. Fighter Control Enhancer. This doesn't seem to do anything, but it does say that it's supposed to change a ship's fighter control range. Now, considering that's already 500 kilometers, I'm not sure we're really going to need this, and that might be why this has no information. It might be that this is one of those things that exists on Fulmination and doesn't actually make it to live, because in finality, it's actually useless. Then we have, and I'm so glad they named them this way, a Fighter Firepower Booster, which increases the firepower of your fighters by 17.5%, and a Fighter Burst Aerator. None of this whole bay loading accelerator crap and stuff that requires me to remember what a different type of speed increase, activation time adjustment increase, is for a weapon system. It's just a Burst Aerator, just like a Cannon Burst Aerator or a Laser Burst Aerator, and that makes me happy. Now you'll notice on these that it does have a bit that says it has a capital module license. Now when you tap on this, it doesn't bring anything out, and I don't think, I've heard some people already sitting there saying, oh, this means you're going to have to pay Aurum for a license to fly capitals and some crap like that. I really don't think that's the case. Now look, it doesn't show it on these, because these are obviously, these are capital level gear, but whereas it does on the rigs, we get that capital module license. But I think that just means can only be fit to carriers, and that's kind of the key point for me here. Can only be fit to carriers. It means that you can't accidentally fit a Fighter Burst Aerator onto a Vexor and then go, oh, why aren't my drones firing faster? It's just a way of making sure it only fits onto capital ships. Whereas the modules, they're described as as capital, as the C, so rather than S, M, or L for small, medium, and large, it's got C for capital. You'll see that these don't have that capital ship license. What they do have instead is a power grid requirement of 21,434 megawatts. So you're not going to fit that onto anything. That's bigger than the power grid of most ships that I know. You're not going to accidentally cram that onto a Vexor or an Algos or some other, smaller ship. Whereas obviously rigs don't have a power grid, so the capital module license there, as far as I'm concerned, means that it's just only going to fit onto capital ships, which is pretty awesome. And I'm not sure how that's going to work with integrated rigs. I've already got people saying, hang on a second, if these have capital license and they only fit on capitals, are they going to fit into integrated rigs? And as far as I'm aware, the answer is currently no, but I wouldn't be surprised equally if they do. Now, overall then, that's having a look at the modules, but how do I think carriers are actually going to fit into Eve Echoes? Because I've been pretty disparaging on capital ships in general, but especially on dreadnoughts. Now, my biggest problem with dreadnoughts is that capital ships require a complete investment in their stats. If you look at how much the skill point investment changes between, for example, frigate command and destroyer command, then destroyer command to cruiser command and cruiser command to... You can extrapolate that upwards and look at what a battleship costs, and then have a look at what those skills for a capital ship might be. And that's just an estimate, but it's monstrous. And basically, if you're a Tech 10 player and you've been playing since the very start of the game, you've been using, Combo Omega the entire time, and you've had things like Cognitive Neuroscience 3 running the entire time, you probably are still not going to be able to come anywhere close to maxing out capital level skills. And we now know it is capital, it's not capital skill, it's carrier skill or dreadnought skill. They are different classes at capital size. Kind of like battle cruiser and cruiser, a side by side. There's a size difference there as well, but they're still medium ships, if that makes sense. Here, we know it's it's carrier skill and it's dreadnought skill. So if you're going to skill into carriers, then you're going to be using a lot of SP on carrier skills. You're going to have to dedicate your character to flying carriers. Now for carriers, this kind of is okay because it looks like they'll actually be able to do PvE as well as PvP. However, dreadnoughts, the issue just simply in my head is that you're going to spend a lot of skill points specializing into dreadnoughts. You're going to dedicate a character to flying dreadnoughts, and those dreadnoughts are only useful in large-scale PvP. They are only useful if your corporation is trying to take out a citadel, or if they're trying to take out an enemy fleet of capital ships. So if that's not happening, then that character is otherwise useless. Whereas with carriers, at least it looks like your character is going to have uses outside of just niche PvP scenarios. So I'm still not sold on dreadnoughts. I think you are going to have to be a very special type of player who flies dreadnoughts. You're going to have to dedicate an entire character to them, and that character is going to exist solely for taking out enemy citadels or taking out enemy carriers and capitals. If there is no PvP going on, that character is useless, whereas carriers, I do think, are going to have some uses outside, and therefore I may personally be tempted to try and skill into carriers. We will have to see when they launch, and once I've got my teeth into a bit more of them, I'm trying out in PvE and things like that to see if that's content that they can actually clear and at what speed they can do it. Anyway, that's my thoughts and opinions here regarding carriers. Please let me know yours. I know I've been very disparaging of dreadnoughts. I still don't think they're worth adding yet. And ultimately, the fact that carriers exist, it gives dreadnoughts a bit more reason, but still not enough. So there's a part of me that still wishes carriers weren't around either, because I think there's more important stuff than capital ships right now, but at least carriers do still have some kind of use outside of those niche PvP scenarios. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on these. Have you been playing any of the virtual test interference? How have you gotten on with them? Have you won any of them? What do you think of the different carriers? How are you enjoying them? Are you going to be flying them? Let me know in the comment section down below. Otherwise, folks, happy sailing, and see you in New Eden.